Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today we will be talking through part 3 of this horse eye tutorial. The relative real-time version of part 3 will be listed down below, as well as a link to part 2's tutorial, the reference, the drawing and the grid size, as well as all the materials that I use. Not necessarily for this tutorial, but the entire material list that I have for all my drawings. So in this part we will be starting the actual fur texture layers and getting to a point where we can start finalizing the values and the details. This is quite a repetitive process, so this particular tutorial will be shorter than the first two, just for this reason, as I can only say so much about one type of layering process, application method and so forth. In the end, we also start deepening up the values on the tack to start finalizing them for the detail layers. So to start the fur layers, I try to break them up into smaller, more manageable areas. So this is just to help my brain kind of make it more digestible. So with this drawing, I use the contours of the face and the veins as my imaginary lines. You can divide it up as you want. You can even, divide it up with lines if you would like to do so, make a whole quadrants or grids or whatever. So due to these layers being soft, it's quite easy to blend the sections together and make them look seamless. So I'm not worried about there being random like lines and so forth. That's why I keep these kind of layers very together and do them similarly across the board, so that I kind of stop having those lines to see where I worked from one side to the other, and they just blend seamlessly together. So my most used tool will be the mono eraser, and my pencils will range from 5H to 5B. So the 5H and the 5B I will use more sparingly. My most used pencils will then be the F, the HB, the B and the 2B, and the mono eraser being kind of the workhorse of these layers. So the fur is, I like to build up the texture from the get-go. So I want that depth and that substance so that it looks actually real. This just prevents it from looking flat and just looking like a subsurface, kind of a surface level texture. So to build up this texture, I will start with a loose and quick application of powder, which is, if you've been watching my videos for a while, you kind of know this is a very habitual step in my drawing process. And then I will follow that up with the mono eraser to start the fur texture. So I'll also follow up with pencils in areas that are darker, blend them out, and then repeat the process with the mono eraser. As each layer progresses, your application of both the mono eraser and the pencils will become more precise throughout. So with both tools, it's important to always move in the direction of the fur. And as the layers get added, you will start to vary the length and the angle of the direction of each of your pencil or mono eraser strokes. So in the initial layers, it's quite loose, quick, fast. It's just a very easy way just to kind of help yourself mark out which way the direction of the fur goes, and also the contours of those areas, areas of interest where you want to kind of focus. It's not supposed to be the same length, same size, whatever. It's supposed to look very homogeneous in the beginning. It's not supposed to look very varied because it's those initial layers. So I've already mentioned kind of looking homogeneous. So as you add those layers and start to vary pressure and length of your kind of application of your pencil strokes and your mono erasers, this will kind of ensure that your texture starts to vary from the beginning. So with fur, it is the same texture, but if you've seen any like animal up close or any fur, it's homogeneous from far away, but once you get very up close like this piece, once it becomes homogeneous in those final detail layers, it starts to look not real, because not every hair strand is the same. So you want that variation from kind of your second and third layer onwards. So something I like to do with the mono eraser to kind of get that variation is where I start the application of my eraser. So do I pull from the bottom up or pull from the top down? So where you start your initial application, that will be the same with powders and pencils. You will have a kind of slightly darker or lighter area depending on whether you're using the pencil or the mono eraser. So that will also add variation, and you'll see I kind of change it up in certain areas. Like go back and forth, and that just changes kind of the look and how it fades out. And for certain areas, it kind of fades in the same direction. So that's also something you need to take note of. So with the pencil, this variation will come into the pressure with which you apply the pencil. And you don't want the similar pressure across the board. So certain areas obviously are darker. In those final detail layers, it will become kind of important there. So you want to highlight certain strands, make them a little bit more visible, add, kind of those harsher texture looks with a more visible strand here and there. So the variation, your pressure also comes in with the mono eraser, but for those later layers, it's not really that big of a thing. So obviously this is a face of an animal, so there will be contours, maybe veins, areas that are more sunken and raised. So for the veins and the very noticeable contours of the face, you will need to pay attention to the direction of the fur and the way it lays over top. Obviously the way the fur lays over top, that's the thing that denotes, along with their values and the highlights and the shadows, kind of shows you the contours of those areas. So you will need to change your approach for those areas and the areas surrounding it compared to the flatter, more kind of spaced out areas closer to the tack. So this will actually require you to have a more back and forth application between your pencils and your mono erasers to achieve that rounded and sunken look. And that's where I'd like to add the addition of the blending stumps as well, just to add that blended look and kind of ensure that it has a nice rounded look to it. And sunken, also for the sunken areas, you'll add more depth to it as well. So for these areas, the length of your fur will also be different. So this is very much where you have to start paying attention to the variation of the fur themselves. So I very much like to use these initial layers as kind of an exploration of the texture or the drawing, kind of figuring out how everything works together and, what makes this texture look like this. So in these areas, you will have a different length of fur just because of the contours itself, and you will need to also take note the direction the fur goes because it changes quite rapidly, and your application of these tools will obviously change in these areas as well. So I bumped up kind of the range that I use for these areas just to get it a little bit darker, but these layers, kind of in relation to what's going on around it, will look darker than it will in the end. So we've still got quite a lot of contrast still to add. So I haven't mentioned powder a lot, but I do use it with every layer. So I do add powder, and that's just to blend everything out, give it a little wash of gray, take away the harshness of those initial layers. So I want that more bold, harsh look for the final layers and not for the layers below it, because that's the foundational layers. Those are kind of your more out of focus layers. So I reserve those harsher looks for the end. That doesn't mean I will stop my application of powder, but your application then with your pencils becomes a lot more bold and harsh. So why I also like to use the powders is the mono erasers on very heavily powdered areas versus more heavily penciled areas will look different. And that will also add the variation in your fur itself. So you will need to work a little bit harder with your mono erasers in areas that have a lot more pencil layers than powder layers. So for areas that are lighter, I like to keep it more heavily powdered with a lighter application of pencils, and then your mono erasers will just behave a lot differently and be a lot more harsh, let's say harsh, very noticeable compared to areas where it's a very heavy pencil layers, and that will come into part more for the later kind of applications where we build up the contrast. But that's just how I ensure like more blended soft areas stays looking blended and soft. So starting with the tack, we will be deepening up the values. So this is just a continuation of part 2. So watch part 2 and you'll kind of get the gist of this whole tack business. We're just adding a little bit more depth and a texture here and there. So in these initial layers, not in the initial layers, but in these layers I also like to make adjustments. So when I leave a drawing for a little bit and come back, I notice things that are maybe out of place, a little bit too small, too large. So the most noticeable adjustments I make are to the holes in the leather straps. So that's just making them larger or smaller, or just changing their placement in the leather strap. So because the layers in the initial parts were soft, it's very easy to make these adjustments. Before you go, I like to make these adjustments before those final layers. So this just kind of prevents you from, in those final detail layers, seeing something that's very off or wrong. So for these kind of layers, still use very much the same range, 2H, F, HB, 2B, and 5B. So the 5B I go in very bold, heavy-handed with the darker layers to darker values just to deepen them up. I use the 2H a lot, and that's just over top of layers of F and HB pencils. So that just smooths it out and gives it a slightly deeper value and a unique value. This also is very nice for areas that are lighter. So for the tack, because it's a different texture to the fur, you will see that I don't use powder as much. More blending stumps that are dirtier have already got a few powders on it. So it's just to ensure that it has a different look to it. So the 2H I use quite a bit just to smooth things out and use it as a blending tool for the other pencil layers. So the mono eraser I just use to accentuate the highlights and the shapes, very similarly to the pencils for the leather and the metal themselves. So this is, like I said, a continuation of the first two parts. Very similar steps involved. It just, you can even see very similar pencil range, just used and applied in a different manner, and you'll start to get a different look. So in the first layers, I'm very kind of cautious, conservative with my application. It's a lot softer, out of focused, very blended. And then you can see with those same pencils, I can achieve a darker, more in-focused look. So that's just the point of my layering process, is you can have a very limited range of pencils and maybe just add one or two darker ones as you go along. And you can build up the layers very quickly to achieve that desired look in the end. So that's the short and the sweet of it. I hope it makes sense, and I'll see you all for the next one, which is hopefully the final detail layer part. With most of my detail layers, I have no idea how long they take. So it's dependent on the drawing itself. So I will see you all for the next one. Don't know if it will be the final one, but happy drawing. Cheers, everyone.